So we're going to continue this unit with migration. So we've been talking about population growth. Now we'll talk about how populations move around. Mobility is the term that's used to show how people, to describe how people moved from one place to another. When we're talking about short-term or repetitive acts of movement, we're talking about circulation. So if you go to visit your grandparents every single summer, that's circulation. When you move away to college and you come home each spring or you come home for the summer, that's circulation. You're not migrating back and forth. So migration is a permanent move. And it could be a permanent established home, even if you're only planning on staying there for 5 years or 10 years. But the point is you're establishing a home and you're living there on a regular basis. So when we talk about migration, you could break that down into emigration, which is when you exit an area. So think about the E in emigration, the E in exit. So emigration is when you leave, and immigration is when you move into an area. So immigration is coming into an area. And most countries have somebody moving into and people moving out of at the same time. So the difference between the number of immigrants and the number of emigrants is called the place's net migration. And we talked about net migration already when we looked at the demographic equation, so the equation that talked about population growth that accounted for immigration and emigration. So we've already referenced net migration this year. Within migration, we have international. So with an international migration, we have a permanent move from one country to another. International migration is also called transnational because you're moving between countries. And you can choose, so you have voluntary migration, you decide to move to another country. And you have forced, where you have to flee for your life. And then we have internal migration. That's when you're permanently moving within a country. And then you have interregional, which is when you move from one region to another. So if you're moving from like Florida to Washington State or Oregon, that would be interregional. You're moving between regions. And then you have intra-regional, which is when you move within a region. So if you were going to permanently move from Boynton Beach to Tampa, that would be intra-regional. When you migrate internationally, we're going to talk about forced migration today. So forced migration falls under 3 categories, at least for political migrants. And the United Nations has a High Commission for Refugees, and they have 3 different groups that they recognize. When we're talking about refugees, we're talking about a political problem. You're looking at persecution. So people have to leave because they are in fear of their life. If they stay, they will be persecuted, and most likely they will be put to death. So a refugee has been forced to migrate to avoid a potential threat to his or her life, and he or she cannot return for fear of persecution. And a refugee is someone who's actually left their home country. So they've traveled to a new country, and they've been pushed out. If you've left your city because of maybe a civil war or a terrorist attack, but you've stayed within your country, but you can't go back to your home because maybe it's destroyed or it's not safe, then you're an internally displaced person. So an internally displaced person is like a refugee, but they're someone who has stayed within their country. So if you see like a refugee camp, but the refugee camp is really within that same country, like a refugee camp for Syrians in Syria, they're really classified as internally displaced persons. And then we also have asylum seekers. An asylum seeker is someone who goes to another country in the hopes of being recognized as a refugee. So a lot of the people who have been coming into the U.S. from Central America, some of them are asking for asylum. They want to be recognized as a refugee. So they've come here to explain why it's dangerous for them to go back home. And they're hoping to get that asylum status. We also have refugees that can come not just for political reasons, but for environmental reasons. So after the earthquake in Haiti, we had people migrate to the U.S. and we brought them as temporary refugees because they could not go back home because their homes had been destroyed and they didn't have the infrastructure in place to support the rebuilding of these destroyed neighborhoods. And, the rebuilding has been slow because of some corruption and also because of the multiple hurricanes that have hit Haiti since. So you could have an environmental cause that makes you a refugee as well. One other type of forced migration that isn't necessarily happening now, but the U.S. has that part as part of our, of our historic, our cultural legacy and part of our history. Unfortunately, as another type of forced migration is slavery. So someone who has been forced into slavery, that's forced migration. You didn't choose to move to a new country. You were sold into slavery. And it's not a refugee because you're not coming here to get protection. So slavery is another type of forced migration and one that isn't occurring the way it had in the past. So forced migration could also include prison colonies, so Georgia was a prison colony, Australia was a prison colony. And so you were forced to leave the country, that was your choice, leave the country or stay in jail. So those are also other types of forced migrations, although not modern day ones. So these are more historical examples.